The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. When Judas had left them, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If himself, and God will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little while longer. I give you a new commandment: love one another. As I have loved you, so you also should love one another. This is how all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In John's Gospel, one of the last lines is, "This is how all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Now let's look at the setting. John is sharing the moment when Jesus was at the table, the Last Supper, and Judas was just identified as the one to betray Jesus. And as the Gospel began, Judas left. And Jesus then announced that he would not be with them much longer. What's interesting is the disciples, they weren't aware of anything grand or anything monumental that was to take place. Once again, they were hearing what it was that Jesus had to share with them. At this particular time, the message was this new command, this command to love one another. And what's interesting is Jesus' command says, you will be known as my disciples if you love. This is quite a revelation for us if we stop and think about what the society must have been like in that day, if by the mere fact that the way that each other was treated, especially if you treated each other with love and respect, that it was so different that you would be recognized as different, recognized as one who followed Christ. Today we call us Christians because we follow Christ. Then it was identified as the disciples of Christ. But to imagine that the society was such that if you loved and treated each other with respect, you stood out as being different. Sometimes when we read the scriptures, we need to think in terms of life as it was when the words were written. If we can see this message that Jesus had of being different in those days, also applies for us in being different today. Paul and Barnabas, as we hear in the Acts of the Apostles, were out spreading this gospel message. And one of their messages that they kept reminding the different communities that they went to was to persevere, for there would be many hardships and struggles along the way. And Paul and Barnabas reminded them that in the midst of these struggles that life continues, and the message of Christ was still present, but there were hardships that would need to be endured during the journey. Imagine, if you will, if we took a look at the commandment of Jesus, and he gave us the instructions to love as he loved. So how is it then that we can carry out that commandment to love? Love for us has so many different meanings. We use it in so many different ways. I think we should kind of focus on how Jesus intended love to be shared with others. Father John Vianney put it well when he looked at the call to love others. Love for our neighbor, as he puts it, consists of three things: to desire the greater good for all is number one. The second is to do what we can when we can. And the third, to bear, to excuse, to hide the faults of others. Father Vianney does a great job in helping us to understand understand what this call of love is. So let's look at these. The desire for the greater good of all. When our outlook and our perspective and our goals are to promote the good of others, it begins to shift our focus from ourselves, outside of ourselves, to others. That I see as the primary call of this commandment, where we begin to look at what is good for all, not just for us. In our society today, is that what we hear in media? Who are we supposed to look out for first? Ourselves. But yet Father John Vianney reminds us that it's not ourselves that we're called to look out for if we want to follow the commandment of Christ to love others. Our call is to look beyond ourselves and to act and to have our actions be for the common good, the good of all. If we strive for the good of others, it also helps us to place value, to place worth, to recognize that others beside us also are God's children, that they too have great worth and great value. So the desire for the good of all helps us place others first, and our benefits, the benefits in society, are quite grand in that it affects not just us, but those that we interact with, to promote the good of all. Next, Father John says to do what we can when we can. I am a computer consultant. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an engineer. I'm a logical thinker. I'm not a creative person. I'm male. I'm not female. You see, I have certain gifts and talents and charisms that I've received from God, and I'm called to use these when I can to help others. And so to follow this, the second understanding of our call to love, to do what we can when we can, from our own resources, the gifts that God has given to us, how do we use that, and do we use these gifts and talents for others? My wife, Lisa, has said several times that in her search to understand God's will for her, that she understands that the limits that she has are by the gifts that God has given her, that she's called to do and called to affect the people in her environment. And so it is, we don't need to be Mother Teresa to all. We don't need to be Pope Benedict Emeritus to all. We simply need to do what we can when we can in the sphere of influence that we find ourselves. There's another term that the church uses to, I think, synthesize this command, this call to love, and that's through stewardship, managing the gifts and the talents and the treasures that we have for the betterment and for the love of others. We're also called, and I think this is the most interesting of the three, to bear, to excuse, and to hide the faults of others. What word can we associate with this call? Gossip. Gossip is so life-draining as opposed to life-giving. You see, if we focus on the negative traits of people, we do not promote love, but rather we tear down each other. So to bear the faults and bear the guilts and to know that others have weaknesses does not arm us with information to share with others. Our challenge is not to gossip, not to talk about others. Rather, we're called to focus on the good of others. We're to focus on the strengths of others. For who here today, this morning, does not have a fault, does not have a shortcoming, a weakness, or a failure? Who here would like to be put in the position of one being gossiped about? So this is, I think, the most challenging for us to fulfill this commandment to love. We simply sometimes wash gossip and we slide it away as being a bit humorous. But when we break it down into the words of Father John Vianney, to bear, to excuse, and to help conceal the faults of others, places us in a position where we can now be in a relationship and we can now have love and respect, that same love and respect that Jesus calls us. So, how will you be known? Are you a disciple of Jesus? And this is how you will be known, by the way that you love, to desire the greater good of all, to do what you can when you can, and to bear and excuse and to hide the faults of others. When we begin to fulfill the command that Jesus gave us, we too will be able to love one another as Jesus has loved us.